Something very drastic is happening in Russia right now. Everywhere you look, Russian oil refineries, oil storage depots, and now power plants are on fire due to Ukrainian drone strikes and other related efforts, a crisis that Russian leadership is struggling to contain, and which is undermining the integrity of Russia's domestic energy supplies. At the same time, the Kremlin is suffering from another parallel energy crisis, struggling to find sufficient international buyers for their vast energy resources, due to sanctions and diminished international status. Each of these crises then feeds and exaggerates the same underlying problem. Simply stated, Russia is pumping far more oil and gas than they can physically store, sell, or use. Sanctions are preventing most energy resources from leaving the country, even if not with perfect effectiveness. And Ukrainian strikes against the already limited Russian storage and refining capacity are preventing energy resources from being stored or used at home. Since Russia now has nowhere to put the oil they take out of the ground, they have to stop production, because with nowhere to store oil, there's no way to pump it. And this is turning Russia's biggest economic advantage, abundant, cheap energy resources, into what is quickly, and ironically, becoming Russia's Achilles heel. And as the effects of sanctions and Ukrainian strikes on Russia's energy sector work together and begin to finally reach maturity, the massive reserves of Russian crude oil and natural gas strewn across Siberia are coming to the point where they may soon be forced to sit almost completely idle. That's a massive problem for Russia, and it goes far beyond the mere loss of short-term profits. In fact, the problem is so large and so widespread that it could have the long-term effect of destabilizing Russia's entire economy for decades. And since most of Russia's economy is indeed dependent on profits from energy exports, that's not an exaggeration. This is something where the impacts won't be seen overnight, but where the effects will be very real nonetheless, as Russia eventually burns through its reserves of money and other materials and begins to, literally, scrape the bottom of the barrel, to a degree that can no longer be hidden from the Russian people. You see, with Russia now becoming forced to turn off many of its oil wells, perhaps even the majority of them, the problem is that while oil wells are simple enough to turn off, having the ability to turn them back on again in the future is not guaranteed, fast, or cost-effective, due to Russia's real main archenemy, the cold, harsh Russian winters. And this isn't a mere Western talking point. In fact, this is something that Russia itself has long been more than happy to officially acknowledge when it benefited them to do so, but which Russia is now predictably trying to hide or deny in the case of their war against Ukraine. For example, for decades, Russia has cited risks associated with freezing oil infrastructure as an excuse for not participating in OPEC efforts to reduce oil production. These production-reducing efforts are something that the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries often does to create artificial energy shortages that then raise global energy prices, increasing profits for OPEC member nations. Because of Russia's cold weather excuse, and the fear that Russian oil wells and pipelines would freeze if production were stopped or reduced, when the OPEC Energy Alliance has then proceeded with their reduced production plans, Russia has usually been allowed to exclude themselves. This has allowed Russia to benefit from rising energy prices without having to suffer the corresponding loss in production and export volumes. A great deal for Russia, to be sure. But now that their oil infrastructure is suffering from the war in Ukraine, Russian leaders are presenting things to their people as if it's no big deal, and that it's actually, totally okay to shut off an oil well in the middle of winter, and that there's, definitely no risk at all. Pinky promise. Here's your vodka and your enlistment papers. Obviously, in one of these situations, Russia is lying, and it's clear which instance that is. Right now, the Kremlin is being forced to shut down Russia's oil wells without creating a panic amongst the Russian people. So, of course, they're going to want to present it as no big deal. But the Kremlin has to work especially hard to do this, because the complications associated with freezing oil wells have been well documented. And when you hear how bad those complications really are, you'll realize what a bad spot Russia is really in. When you shut off an oil well in Russia, even when you can turn it back on, oil production from that well is often diminished, forever, due to complications that arise from freezing the wellhead. And in some cases, entire wells even have to be re-drilled when wellheads are damaged beyond repair by freezing conditions, forcing oil companies to repeat one of the most expensive aspects of crude oil production over and over again, losing money the entire time. And even when all of this is successful, the process of turning the wells back on can be extremely time-consuming to execute. Shockingly so. Often, this process is not just a matter of days, weeks, months, or even years, but decades. That's because once oil wells are turned off, every inch of thousands of kilometers of oil pipelines has to be physically inspected before those pipelines can be safely used again, due to extensive damage that can permeate any point along the entire pipeline once it freezes up and sits unused. It's like what happens when you forget to winterize a boat or an RV, but on steroids. As an example of this, the last time that Russian oil wells were shut off en masse, like what is now going on as a result of the war in Ukraine, took place in 1989 around the collapse of the Soviet Union. In that case, once the oil wells went offline, the harsh Siberian winters ensured that it took over 30 years to get them all back online again, and to bring Russian oil production back up to pre-collapse levels. The effort required massive support from Western nations, who helped Russia because they wanted to see the Russian economy recover and benefit from having Russian energy on the global market, a sign of goodwill towards Russia following the long-anticipated end of the Cold War. Western companies helped provide the labor and technology needed for millions of man-hours of manual work, and invested tens of billions of dollars into the effort, only for Russia to then turn around and betray them by invading Ukraine almost as soon as Russia's energy production capacity was finally fully restored to Cold War levels. Russia apparently felt that their next step to further profitability was no longer repairing infrastructure, but forcing competitors like Ukraine off the market. And now, as a result of Putin's war, this extensive damage, which has just finally been repaired, could happen all over again. Though this time, for obvious reasons, Western support for reconstruction probably will not be as forthcoming. For each Russian oil well that is shut off, there is an exponential impact that ripples across the future of the Russian economy, creating more and more expenses, with less and less remaining oil resources Russia can sell to help pay for those rising expenses. And there is a tipping point where Russia literally cannot recover without extensive international help. This isn't even counting any resources Russia may eventually have to pay towards the reconstruction of Ukraine. So if Russia wants an economy of any significant size over the next several decades, it's now a race against time for the Kremlin to end their war against Ukraine as soon as possible, while their energy infrastructure is still sufficiently intact to allow for recovery. This is something that gets less and less likely with each passing day, as Ukrainian strikes continue, Russian long-term storage bursts at the seams, and oil wells are turned off, one after the other. It's no wonder that Russia has now made oil production numbers an official state secret. Most likely, if the full force of these facts were well known and easily accessible across Russia, the people would panic, and possibly even revolt. Understandably so, as their entire futures, and those of their children and grandchildren, are at stake. To help accelerate this process, Ukrainian strikes against Russia's energy infrastructure are continuing, and even appear to be rapidly accelerating. And as you can now see, these strikes are much more meaningful than many people have given them credit for. Some have portrayed Ukraine's strikes on Russian energy infrastructure as a mere small nuisance for Russia that the Kremlin can easily overcome. But closer analysis reveals that when the full impact of these strikes is understood, it's clear that it's something that should be making Russian leadership very, very nervous about their future. As it stands, Ukraine has been wreaking havoc on Russia using small drones with less than 5 kilograms of explosives to start oil fires that spread quickly and are very difficult and sometimes impossible to put out. A very inexpensive platform that causes very extensive damage, providing an extremely high return on investment if you can view things that way. Apparently, all it takes is a couple small drones consistently thrown at energy infrastructure to make the entire Russian economy unstable in the long term. And what's even worse for Russia, all of this is being done with Ukraine's own equipment, since they aren't currently allowed to use Western weapons to strike this far into Russian territory. Drones aren't especially well equipped to take out oil depots or refineries, and yet they're still managing to get the job done. One can only guess how much worse the consequences for Russia could be if the restrictions on the usage of Western weapons are ever lifted, allowing long-range missiles to be used for this purpose as well. These types of strikes against Russia's energy infrastructure, of course, aren't new. Ukraine has been carrying out such attacks throughout the war, especially throughout 2024. But the long-term impact of these strikes on Russia's economy and war efforts is now becoming very apparent. When they suffered early strikes, Russia was able to hide the impact due to the fact that they still had sufficient infrastructure in operation for their needs, and sufficient reserves of parts to help them repair facilities that were damaged. But those stockpiles of spare parts were designed to meet the demands of occasional mechanical failure, not the demands created by intentional sabotage or a full-scale war. And since most of those spare parts were originally provided by Western companies that have since sanctioned Russia, the Kremlin has found themselves unable to source additional replacements, causing the stockpiles of important parts to be drastically reduced and sometimes completely exhausted over time. Even worse, in order to install them, many of these parts require technical expertise that is mainly held by Western tradesmen, who, before the war, would travel into Russia on short-term contracts to do their jobs. So Russia now not only lacks the parts, but also the technical expertise required to use them. Russian oil refineries are therefore being forced to use non-original parts installed by non-qualified maintenance personnel. In practice, this is like trying to have a chainsaw mechanic replace a part on a BMW with a part that was originally made specifically for a Toyota, or more accurately, and much worse, a part that was made specifically for a Russian Lada. The problems with that approach should be apparent. You might be able to duct tape a few things together this way for the short term, but there are many problems this approach can't solve, and many additional problems that this approach creates. In some cases, those knock-on problems become so extensive that it could force complete rebuilds. And speaking of knock-on problems, another issue is that the lack of Western maintenance personnel means the few Russian experts that do exist are also being spread very thin, repairing broken refineries instead of doing the preventative maintenance they would usually be doing. And a lack of preventative maintenance creates, you guessed it, more knock-on issues. In practice, this lack of parts and personnel doesn't just create problems for the facilities that Ukraine has physically damaged or destroyed. It also creates problems for every other oil facility in Russia as well, which still depend on this same small stockpile of spare parts for their regular maintenance. And that means that even oil refineries that are far outside of the range that Ukraine can strike are still suffering. As one example of potential problems, even before Ukraine's attack on Russia's refineries had begun, a stoppage at a Russian refinery caught widespread media attention, as Russia's Lukoil refinery was unable to fix a faulty gas compressor for several months, a job that should have only taken a couple of weeks at most. As the war increasingly consumes these hard-to-get parts, this will only get exponentially worse, and more oil infrastructure across Russia will become literally impossible to repair. So in short, Russia, even as one of the world's largest oil exporters, only has so much energy infrastructure to work with. And once that infrastructure is gone, it's gone, and can't be replaced or repaired quickly, if at all, while the war in Ukraine is still ongoing. Just based on the capabilities they've proven so far, Ukraine has the range to reach and strike up to 18 different Russian refineries, more than half of the Russian total, and all of the refineries that are close enough to provide efficient supply to the Russian front lines. If all of these were to go offline, it would definitely be catastrophic for Russia's economy, but also for Russia's war effort. War, of course, is incredibly fuel-intensive, with everything from cars, trucks, tractors, tanks, planes, jets, and more requiring a consistent supply of high-quality fuel to continue functioning. The short-term impacts of this can be contained by the Kremlin, with few people in the Russian public being the wiser as to what's going on. The true economic cost of the war can be easily hidden, for a while, by digging into old stockpiles and government savings, along with massive helpings of Russian propaganda. But Russia is now getting closer and closer to the edge where they will completely run out of those resources. And when they do, and they run out of money to pay for their government, their military, and their pensions, the Russian people are definitely going to notice. Already, Russia's had to stop exports of refined oil products on several occasions due to massive shortages at home, and has had to start importing refined fuel from Belarus to make up for the shortfall. Quite an embarrassing situation for one of the world's largest energy exporters. And those types of situations aren't going to get better, but can only become much worse as the war in Ukraine continues to drag on. This isn't the full story on Russia's energy crisis, it's just one chapter. For more on that, check out this previous video I made covering some other different details, or check out the other video on screen if that one sounds more interesting. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.